Hello, and welcome to the first in a new series, AWS Cloud Financial Management Talks. Today we have David Lambert, who is with our AWS Cloud Economics team, who is joining us to discuss how to design your AWS cost allocation strategy. The CFM Talks series will focus on cloud financial management, and we often talk about this in terms of plan, run, see, and save. Plan is setting those expectations around cloud costs for your projects, your applications, your business units. Maybe it's planning for a new workload versus an existing one. It could be either way. Run, how do you manage and control that once you're starting to use AWS? How do you access that billing information and set some guardrails so you can maintain control around that cost? See, how do you actually get visibility into real-time or near real-time visibility for your cost and usage information and make some of those informed decisions? And that's actually part of what we're talking about today. And then save, taking control of costs and continually optimizing your spend. So today we're talking about the C pillar, and as we started the call, we had asked a question about what does your current cost allocation process look like? And as you can see, that is looking like we've got a variety of folks in here. We've got almost a third of the people, or right around a third, that don't know what their process is today. 14% are in the planning, 39% have a manual process, and 12% are automated. So we've got a variety of experiences here. And this talk is really focused around that beginning strategy piece. It's not going to get into a deep dive into how to automate everything. It's going to talk about the strategy that goes into it. And so some of those customer questions, each one of these talks will be based around customer questions. And so kind of the common questions we get are around, how do I allocate within my cost centers? How do I make my end users accountable? What were my high profit margin or product margins? Where was my spending most of my time? How does that compare to what we actually earn on that particular product or application? And our product has grown, and I only want the expenses that are mine to do it. One of the things we see a lot of times is as time goes by, your account may change, your spending may change. And so how do I get those expenses that are only related to my thing as part of what I'm responsible for? And then if you've got these shared resources, how do I get them back to where they belong? So as David goes through this presentation, you may also have questions. And please use that questions panel and go to webinar to ask them. We have planned time at the end to answer questions. We actually have a lot of time at the end to answer questions. So please go ahead and use that. We'll bring them forward at the end. You will be receiving a link to this presentation in an email later today, but it won't be handed out during this call. But now I'm going to hand it over to David Lambert to go through the agenda and get us started on the meat of the presentation. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Excited to be able to talk with you a little bit about cost allocation. So agenda-wise, we're going to cover some definitions, kind of level set, make sure everyone's on the same page as to what cost allocation is, what we mean by that. And then we'll talk a little bit about chargeback and showback and some of the differences between those. Next, we're going to talk about actually designing your model for cost allocation and one that really works for you, that works for your business. And then we'll finish up with the tools that help to enable cost allocation. And there's a number of tools out there, so we'll keep it kind of high level, but we'll dive into it as much as we possibly can. Then we're going to summarize everything that we learned and talk a little bit about next steps, and then we'll go into Q&A. So let's get started. First and foremost, definitions. So cost allocation is literally an all-encompassing term that describes the assigning of or distribution of incurred costs to the users or beneficiaries of those incurred costs. So this is in a predefined way, and that's really important to remember that cost allocation typically happens in a predefined way. It's not haphazardly during a end of month cycle or end of year cycle. It's normally defined in a way through revenue or through headcount or something like that, and then costs are sent back or allocated back to the appropriate business units or organizational units. So we talked a little bit about cost allocation there, gave kind of a high level definition. Now we're actually going to dive into what some of the really these are the two main ways to think about cost allocation: showback and chargeback. Showback is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally getting expenses in and then showing back to the end users, to leadership, what people or organizations or applications have spent. It's not an actual charge involving accounting and finance. It is literally just a showback. So think of this as we got expenses in, we use a tool or have used a tool to identify who is using what, even if it's really high level. And then we go and either present to leadership, report out on it, or whatever. Could be a monthly cycle, could be weekly, and say this person, this business unit, this application used X. And that's pretty much where it stops. Now, absolutely, those expenses that are coming in are probably going to get allocated in some predefined fashion that accounting and finance has defined for any sort of central infrastructure or IT organization that is more or less allocating their costs back to the business. So that being said, we then have chargeback, and chargeback is exactly what it sounds like as well. It's literally taking the expenses similar to showback, but you're actually charging back to an application or a product or a business line, and this is where you're actually using financial systems. You may use a journal voucher or something of that sort, but the expense is getting to the appropriate budget area for whoever or whatever had used that expense. And what we're talking about here too, and I want to just make sure everyone's on the same page, is we're really focusing on AWS spend here. Now, in general, IT chargeback is super complex. There's a ton that goes into it, including labor and overhead software, rent potentially, and a number of other things that are involved in overall IT chargeback. But we're really going to specifically focus on AWS spend and how to think about charging that back to your users. Chargeback is not a replacement for AWS invoicing. I want to make sure that's clear as well. This is an internal process that's done within your organization. So that's really important too, is once that bill comes in, it's how do we use the appropriate tools, processes, automation, etc., data manipulation to ultimately send back the appropriate costs to the people that are responsible for that resource and cost usage. So now we've talked a little bit about what cost allocation is. We've talked a little bit about what showback and chargeback is. Now we'll actually dive into a little more of the differences between chargeback and showback. So we try to create more or less 4 categories that help you understand how different these are, and ultimately the benefits of them, and then some of the drawbacks of implementing a showback or a chargeback process. So first and foremost, showbacks, and then secondly, chargebacks. So we'll look at ease of implementation first. Showbacks are relatively easy to implement. It is, you have a tool, you get the costs that come in, and then you do what? We talked about this. You show it back to leadership, you show it back to the people that are using, but that's, again, kind of where it stops. With chargeback, it's actually using a system, some sort of finance and accounting process to make sure that those expenses get sent to the right budgets, and the right folks are managing those budgets and planning for that expense that's coming into whether it's their application, product, business line, so on and so forth. So the ease of implementation is a little more difficult when it comes to chargeback because there is more involved in it. Secondly, we have end user accountability. So I love to give this analogy because I think it's really helpful. I am a new parent, so I haven't had to deal with this yet. But if you tell your child, please make sure to turn your lights off because in your room when you leave, because it's costing us money, they may or may not do that, right? Sometimes they will, sometimes they'll forget. In general, they're kind of like us. We'll forget to do things, will not remember to do things. They're not really being held accountable for anything, right? So what if you then said, you know what, every time I find your light on, I'm actually going to take $1 out of your allowance. And then you started to do that when they forgot. Which one do you think would let the child kind of learn faster? The one where you just tell them to do something, or the one where you actually have a consequence or something that's resulting in whatever that they did? Probably the latter, right? Probably actually taking that allowance away. And I'm a terrible one to talk because my wife yells at me all the time for leaving lights on. But it's a great analogy and really helpful to kind of let you see that Showback, although it does provide accountability for folks in the way of reporting and talking about what's being spent, when it actually comes to the nuts and bolts of it, charging someone back in that number hitting their budget, that's going to make them really change the way that they're doing something. That's going to make them accountable, and therefore that's going to make them want to optimize more, want to shut off those resources, want to re-architect in a way that may reduce cost, starting to think through things like that. The next is tooling sophistication. So with Showbacks, you can basically use things as simple as Excel or Google Sheets or whatever it is, whatever tool that you want to use to manage that. You can also use Cost Explorer, right, as a way to kind of show back. But because chargeback requires a little bit more visibility, it puts a little more accountability on folks. Typically, the tooling sophistication is a little higher when it comes to chargeback. So Showbacks is, hey, we're going to show you everything, but there's not really anything that you can do or have to do with it. Whereas chargeback is, again, they're seeing the cost, it's hitting their line items, and they want to do something about it. So what do you have to do? You have to provide them with the correct tooling, the tooling that actually where they can go in and see everything on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. So they're able to make decisions, and then they're going to be able to see direct results from those decisions of cost going down or whatever it is that they decided to do. So the tooling sophistication gets a little more complicated when you get to chargeback versus showback. Next, we have cultural change. You've probably kind of seen the trend over the last three, but culture change in chargeback is huge. Showback, again, is not a ton of change. Chargeback impacts people, it impacts the business, it impacts technology organizations, and defining what you're going to use as a visualization, cost visualization tool. The accounting and finance team actually taking costs in and being able to parse those out in an appropriate way. Really, in general, the culture change is super high in chargeback, and it's a big shift from what you probably are used to seeing, right? And typically is kind of like IT chargebacks are pretty set. Well, in AWS, in the cloud, it can change on a daily, weekly basis. So it takes a lot of shifting in the culture to be able to manage through that. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what cost allocation is in chargeback and showback, and we've talked about kind of the differences. So let's move on to actually designing a cost allocation model that works for you. So we're going to start with who to involve, and this is, and I'm sure there are many people on the phone or on the call that really have dove in and created their own chargeback model, and they'll tell you if you do it in a vacuum, it's probably going to blow up in your face at some point. You really want to involve all of the right stakeholders to be able to do this in a way that makes sense for the entire organization, the entire company, not just for an individual person or individual unit. So who do you involve in this? First of all, the technology teams. Like typically they're the ones consuming or creating the resources, designing how things work. And then the finance and accounting team. You absolutely need to make sure the technology teams and the finance accounting teams are in lockstep, because if the technology teams design something for chargeback that doesn't work for the finance and accounting organization in the way that they've set up everything as it relates to that, then you're going to have some problems with actually getting the costs back to the right people. So first and foremost, those two folks. Procurement absolutely needs to be involved in just letting them know what this process looks like, making sure that they understand that either it's going to match the invoice perfectly, or there may be some slight variances as far as what they're charging back versus what the invoice says, because you decided to design your allocation chargeback model a little differently. And then finally, the business. And I think that the technology teams and the finance and accounting teams absolutely are the most important, but you can never surprise the business. They are the ones that are ultimately making money for the company. You do not want to surprise them with an all of a sudden new monthly expense that comes in that they have no idea, what's happening with it, why they're getting it, what they have access to control it, and so on and so forth. So really the goal is design it with the technology teams and finance and accounting teams. So make sure the business teams have input, make sure the procurement team understands it. And that will start you off kind of on the right foot of getting to a point where you're able to really dive into some guiding principles. So starting with guiding principles, these are a couple of things, 4 things in particular that really are helpful when you're thinking through designing a chargeback and showback strategy and a cost allocation model, right? So first, it needs to be transparent. And what I mean by this is the allocation process should be completely transparent to the end customer. There should be no secretive, let's add in this, let's add in this. It should be well known how the rate or chargeback process is produced so that your end users are very clear as to why they're getting something. If it's not, you'll start to get questions, you'll start to get people that don't have faith in the system, and so on and so forth. Next, it should be accessible. So the data supporting the allocation model, it should be accessible at any point. There should be a single source of truth. So you should be able to allow your end users to go to some sort of system of record, and they should be able to see what it is that they're getting charged for. And it should absolutely add up to whatever it is that you get charged at, if it's the end of the week or the end of the month or every 2 months or end of the year, whatever you decide your frequency is, it should match that. And that's really, really important. Next, I always like to say that complexity doesn't equal accuracy. The same applies with your cost allocation models. Is the more simple that you can make it, probably the better. Now, there's absolutely reasons for making it a little more complex, which we'll touch on in just a second. But if you can make it simple, that means that I can come in off the street and kind of understand why you're getting to a certain number and how you're getting to a certain number, and then how the overall process fits together without much of a problem. And then finally, remember that someone has to maintain this. So you can automate the heck out of it and make it super complicated and awesome. But if it's really hard to manage all of that, and the slightest change may break your automation process, then you probably need to rethink what you're doing, because you are going to have changes in your organization, in your accounting and finance group, and the way that they have cost centers aligned. So you need to make sure that it's as maintainable as possible. And on top of that, use whatever data you have to join with the actual cost data you have. And what I mean by that is, if you have information around cost centers and application names and departments and how everything lines up, pull that in and join that with your cost and usage data based on some key that you have. And that will make things a lot easier to maintain, because you're able to maintain data separately from something that's automated. So just another trick of the trade. So now we talked a little bit about who to involve. We talked a little bit about the guiding principles. And now what I'm going to try to do is make this a little more tactical. And these are not meant to be comprehensive. It's just meant to guide you in your thinking of, how do we want to go about setting this chargeback process. So on the left, you kind of have our cost allocation granularity. So you start with kind of application, single application. Then you move to like a product or an application suite. And then you go to like a shared resource where multiple people are querying off of a database, or it's a data lake, and multiple people are snagging data out of that data lake and running analytics on it and things like that. And then a business line. So that's kind of the highest level of granularity, or lowest level of granularity, depending on how you're looking at it. You have your finance group and you have your marketing group, and that's it, right? And then what we tried to do was show you the mechanisms in which you can ultimately charge or allocate costs back. And we tried to focus more on AWS and how you can do it, but telemetry-based fixed and proportional, it does apply to a broader like IT chargeback, but specifically what we're talking about here again is AWS spend. So first and foremost, application. You see that kind of lines up with the AWS cost allocation tag, the AWS cost categories, and the AWS account. So the way that you can use that is either through actually tagging a resource and then activating that cost allocation tag within the console, which then lets you filter and sort and group by those specific tags so you're able to report out on it. Cost categories is similar. Cost categories allows you to use multiple dimensions to create a new dimension. So you can use tags and accounts and services and create a new dimension that allows you to report out on it from a cost perspective. Or you can use AWS accounts. You also could use a couple of these to help manage through applications. So sometimes you can use an AWS account to isolate an application, and then everything in that account aligns to an application. Same with the cost allocation tag. Anything that's tagged with a cost allocation tag of application A goes to XYZ cost center or XYZ application. Next, we have application suite or product. So this is where you can get a little creative with how to use cost allocation tags, cost categories, or AWS accounts. Really, what you can do here is for individual applications within an application suite or within a product, you can tag those individually and then have them all sit in an AWS account that's aligned to a product or an application suite ID or cost center and charge back that way. You can also use cost categories to define what you want an application suite or product to look like. If it's multiple tags equal this cost category, then it would go back to that product or application suite. So you see how basically in the first two, you can use a lot of the AWS cost allocation tags, cost categories, AWS accounts as a way to charge back to an end user, as long as you've defined who owns that application, who owns that product or product suite. Next is shared resource. So what I typically recommend is, as a customer, as a previous customer myself, and now an AWS employee, I typically try to recommend avoiding shared resources where possible. I have seen where a shared resource, because it doesn't have an owner, can sometimes result in a lot more waste than individuals actually owning various products and various applications within accounts, because they care more, because they're getting charged directly and they have direct control over that. That being said, there's absolutely reasons and times that it's necessary to have a shared resource and charge that back in a way. So there's kind of two different ways that you can think about shared resources and charging those back. First and foremost is telemetry based. What I mean by that is, say you have a shared database or a data lake and people are querying data from either one of those. You can actually look at the accounts or applications that are querying that data, and you could count up the all of the queries and assign them to the various folks that are querying that data. And then based on whatever the cost is, the total cost in that specific account or through that tag, you could just allocate it back to the folks that are using it based on, say, again, queries or data used or something like that. That's absolutely a way to do it, and it's very possible through using things like CloudTrail and aligning that with the cost and usage report data that we provide to you. The next, in probably the easier way, and I would say it gets you probably 60 to 75, maybe even 80% of the way, is proportional. So looking at your total AWS bill that you have and saying, okay, we know that this is a shared resource that everyone has access to. We're going to look and see what percentage of the bill everyone has used, and then we're going to allocate this spend in this shared resource back to the business lines, to the applications, so on and so forth, through that process. So it might be 10% to app A, 15% to app B, so on and so forth down the line. And then you can use fixed for this, but I don't normally love it because it's not necessarily aligning with actual usage, and there are potentially better ways to do it. Finally, you have business line, and really for this, it can be either proportional or fixed. And fixed might be it's AWS bill comes in, we know that this business line contributes 30% of the revenue, this business line is 30%, and then this business line is 40%. We're going to charge back in that exact same way. So everyone gets their cut, but it doesn't always equal that things are fair. It doesn't mean that people are getting the correct amount that they're actually using. So that's where you can get to proportional, and you could have by accounts, and then or by some other way that you want to design that, and proportionally send the bill back as well. Cool. So we've talked a little bit about guiding principles. We've talked a little bit about who to involve, and now we talk more tactically about what are some ways, some real ways in which we do this. And if you have, if you want to get more involved, you have more questions, feel free to reach out to your account team, and we'll see if we can chat with you at some point. So next, what all of that stuff equals what? It equals accountability initially. So you now have, if you've designed an effective cost allocation model, you now have accountability for that spend, which is crucial to ensuring that you're controlling your spend, that you understand who's using what. You have a single POC or group that's accountable for reviews. So during cost reviews, if it's monthly, bi-monthly, whatever, you have someone that you can go and ask questions, right? Because they're actually responsible for that spend that you allocated them. Next, it provides financial transparency. This one is, I think, one of the most important parts and most interesting parts of AWS and cloud is that you now have an idea of cash allocations towards IT. So you have effective dashboards and tools that you're able to see those cost allocations, or excuse me, those cost allocations, but that's really cash. That's what's going out the door. So that makes a big impact for a company, and that's where you need to really focus on it. Then those two things equal the nirvana of cost allocation, which is essentially informed IT investment. So tracking ROI on projects, empowering your end users to make hard and good decisions around, we spend a lot of money on this IT or this application, and we don't think that it's worth as much as we're spending. We need to find ways to reduce that spend, whether it's through right sizing and data through data lifecycle policies and things like that, or through commercial-based commitment options, through savings plans and RIs, whatever it is. That's where it empowers users to allow you to start to do that. And really what this results in is, like, as a company, you can start to make those decisions around how do we look at, a back office IT application, understand how much we're spending, and then look at a revenue generating application, understand how much we're spending. If you're spending similar amounts on back office IT application, it might be time to rethink why you're doing that and start to think about how do we get more money pumped into our application that's making us money, that is customer facing. So this is really what cost allocation achieves, is it achieves that accountability, that financial transparency, and then informed IT investment and ultimately budgeting. So we've talked a little bit about guiding principles, who to involve. We've talked more tactically how to do it. We've talked about what this results in. So before we kind of move on to tools, I wanted to explain that there are some maturity there are some maturity processes as part of this cost allocation strategy that you're designing. So first and foremost, start with showback. And I say that because you never want to start with chargeback where you're just surprising the business one month. You really want to give them time to see what's coming and make sure that the process is designed in a way that they can kind of see what's happening. And then as they get into a new year or a new budgeting cycle, they can start to budget for what to expect. And that's really important. So designing that showback strategy to start and starting to align that with the chargeback strategy is really important. So once you've kind of done that, typically the next process is moving to chargeback. And this is where really your charges actually go to a cost center, some cost center. So it could be, by application again, by business line, whatever, but there's cost centers that would line up to those, and that's how you would charge back. So people would start to budget, people would start to forecast based on that spend and those expenses that they're getting in from the AWS usage. Then finally, you absolutely don't have to go to step 3. Step 2 is totally fine. Step 3 is where you get to maybe some business unit metrics where you're charging back for, or total cost of ownership. So you combine everything into one rate, including AWS spend, potentially including monitoring software and security software and so on and so forth. Bundling all that together and having a rate that's people can clearly understand, that's going back to the end user. So absolutely can stop at step 2. It's a highly effective way where people see what they're spending, they can control it. Step 3 is kind of that, we want to go a little bit further and make this a broader IT chargeback process. All right, so we've talked about what cost allocation is. We talked about the differences between chargeback and showback. And we've talked about some guiding principles in designing your chargeback and showback strategy. And we've talked about who to involve, more tactically how to do it using accounts and cost allocation tags, cost categories, so on and so forth. And then we talked about the maturity levels of starting with showback, incrementally improving and changing and getting to chargeback, and then even going further than that if that's something that you so desire. Now we'll talk about the tools that enable cost allocation. So first and foremost, AWS Cost Explorer is a great tool that is console-based. It allows you to visualize your data by grouping by certain dimensions and categories, and then also filtering by those same type of dimensions. So you can do that. You can see what you're spending by tag or by account or by service, so on and so forth. And you're really able to kind of manage through that, create your own process through Cost Explorer, and it's also API enabled, and that's really important to remember. So any of the reports, anything that you filter by create, you can always pull that data down into, say, an S3 bucket, and then run your own scripts to transform that data in a way that makes sense for you, and then produce your own chargeback or cost allocation visualization tool. So that's really important to remember too. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's, again, Cost Explorer being API enabled. Next is building your own, and I really love this. We've done a lot with and if you haven't heard about it, go check it out. But the Cloud Intelligence Dashboard Framework. So this is basically an S3 bucket with the cost and usage report in it. And then Glue transforming the data, and then ultimately Athena on the back end running queries, and QuickSight sitting on top of all of that to visualize your data in a way that makes sense. So the fun part about this is you can customize the QuickSight views in really any way you want, through looking and filtering by tags and accounts, kind of grouping those together, cost categories, so on and so forth. So you can start to get to a point where you've designed your own chargeback dashboard with customized KPIs or customized filtering, each customized for an individual application or product owner. So that's a really great way to kind of think about how to design your own and then continue to build that out incrementally. And then finally, our excellent AWS partner network. So we have tons of partners that have awesome cloud management tools, and we will have a link available for all of these things for you to go and check out. But in particular, these are pre-configured tools, and they typically require quite a bit less maintenance than like the build your own dashboard that I just discussed a second ago. So these are kind of plug and play, great tools, visualization of cost and usage, and typically optimizations as well. So certainly something that you can use to build your own cost allocation and chargeback like dashboard visualization tool as well. So really 3 ways and 3 tools, and there's more than one tool in the partner network, I should be clear about, but 3 ways in which you can kind of design your cost allocation strategy and then have tools that support it, and actually can filter by the appropriate things that you want it to filter by and show you, you know, how you should be charging back or allocating costs back. So we've talked about a lot of things, and this was meant to be high level and strategic in helping you kind of start and then think about if you've already done this and you're already very mature in this process. That's okay. Hopefully this provided you with a couple of different ways to think about what you could be doing. Again, happy to talk about this more. Just involve your account team or send a go to contact us through AWS, and happy to chat more about this in detail. But hopefully that provided you with some really good overview strategies around defining and building out your own cost allocation model. So just to recap, we started with cost allocation, the difference between showback and chargeback. Then we talked about who to involve, the guiding principles in ensuring that you are designing a cost allocation model that makes sense and works for you. And then on top of that, we talked about the tools as well. So my call to action really for you is to get started today. If you haven't started, then like involve the right stakeholders and start having this conversation. You know how your business is structured going into that, so that you can start to think about how do we design an allocation strategy that works for finance and accounting and the way that we send expenses between organizations, within our company. Pick that cost visibility tool, apparently. Picking that right tool that works for you, that aligns with your goals and what you need, and the people to actually use it and actually manage through their spend through it. And remember to start simple. You don't have to solve the world's problems in cost allocation to start. It's always going to be iterative. It's always going to be changing. You know, that's totally okay. The fun part is you get to solve like a kind of and create a new thing that didn't exist even a couple of years ago. And then finally, add complexity as needed and reevaluate tooling continuously. So if you picked a tool and it's not working for you, don't force fit everything. Try to think of different ways to use different tools to ensure that it does work for you. And adding a little bit of complexity is totally okay. It's good to think about ways to create unique ways to charge back, as long as what we talked about, right? It's very transparent to the end user, and you're not just adding complexity for the sake of adding complexity. And if you've already done all of this stuff, take a step back and look at where your process is potentially not working, or where there might be gaps in your process, and figure out, you know, how do we get to this next level of making sure that chargeback works for our entire organization. So I just want to thank you for your time today, and more than happy to answer questions now, and hopefully give you additional insight into cost allocation and designing that model for you.
All right. Thank you, David, so much. This has been awesome. I appreciate the enthusiasm you always bring to these. The first question we had way back in the beginning was around, I'm confused about the show back definition. Don't we show back the cost information based on a business agenda versus a budget? Why would we need a chargeback process alongside a budgeting agenda, creating a visibility based on budget?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question, and I hope I am answering it right for you. The difference again between showback and chargeback is when you're, and it's really a cultural thing, when you're showing back your costs. So say you got your costs in and you've decided that, you know, we're going to charge back by each account. So I'm going to show a business line accounts that they're responsible for, and I'm going to say, you know, this is what you spent, this is what you would be responsible for. That's where it stops. That's the difference, is you're not actually allocating those costs. in the way that you're potentially defining what those costs are through the tools that we're giving you. So Showback is just that. It's just showing someone what they've spent and then not doing anything else. Chargeback is providing that additional accountability. So instead of just stopping with the account, here's, you know, the accounts that you've aligned to a business unit and we're, you know, showing you back, we're actually going to charge this and it's going to hit your budget now. So an expense is actually going to move within our accounting processes, hitting your budget. And that means that you have to plan for it and you have to manage it now as well. So that's kind of the difference. I'm not sure if I answered that perfectly for you, unfortunately, but that is exactly the difference between Showback and Chargeback.
Yep, and I mean, thinking it for me, I always think back to, we have tools that when, you know, we're told, hey, you can use this tool and we're not going to charge you for it. This other tool, you're going to get a per user charge. And you always see the scramble of, I don't want to use that one that has a per user charge. I want to use this one that's free to me. Yeah, that's how I always think about this.
It's a great example.
All right. The next one we had was about getting aggregate costs across accounts. Can you do that for identical tag values? So if you've got a tag set up in the same tag set up in multiple accounts, how do I get those aggregated costs across accounts?
Yeah, so you could filter or group by tag, and ultimately it would pull in all of that tag that is that, as long as it's the same key and same value, right, or the same key, I should say. It would pull in all of that information that you would need for that specific tag, and it would pull it all in from all of the accounts. It wouldn't just pull it in from like one individual account unless you were filtered by that account. And depending on if you're using a third-party tool, it'll look a little different than that, or if you're using the Cloud Intelligence dashboard, you know, you could have a filter at the top that you would select the tag that you want, and it would pull all of that information and give you visualizations based on that tag, so that you can make decisions on that.
Yep. And that's all dependent on being in that master payer that can see all
Absolutely.
of those other things. So if you don't, then the other, what's the alternative if you don't have that? Is the only alternative then going through the Kerr or a third-party tool that does the aggregation for you?
So sorry, so you're saying if you don't have tags available?
Well, no, you don't have like a master payer, like you've got 4 accounts, but you didn't put them in an organization yet.
Yeah, so actually the Cloud Intelligence dashboard framework that we just set up has now been enabled to pull in all of that information from multiple payers, that allows you to kind of view that high level, and you can use a third-party tool as well. But yeah, Cost Explorer would only be for that payer, individual payer level.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we, and this is a problem that always comes up. So we're talking about how we do all these resources. We talk about categorizing, and so what is there any advice you can give on how can you auto tag or categorize things when they first come online? Is there?
Yeah. Great question. So one of the things as a customer that I found was the more people that have access to the console in like a manual way, the harder it is to kind of control, you know, tagging processes, what's being created, et cetera, et cetera. Having a way in which people go in and create something is really helpful. So through like Service Catalog, for instance, and then having a pre-populated, more or less, tags that you can select as you're creating your resource is really helpful to start. As a way to automate tagging, unfortunately, there's no easy button where you can just push something and everything is tagged the way that you want it. But there are a lot of tools out there, like say Cloud Custodian, Graffiti Monkey, that are like open source, that allow you to do things like propagating tags to EBS volumes, or using CloudTrail data from a user, having potentially a DynamoDB table that says what that user, what those tags should be as it relates to that user, auto-populating that resource with those tags. There are things that you can do like that. You also can use something that we call service control policies, which is through AWS organizations, and that allows you to actually limit the not just the key, but also the value in which when you're creating a resource with a, say, application ID, having a select amount of application IDs that you can pick from. And if you don't select those, it actually won't let you create the resource. So there's a lot of different ways to think through that. You know, I've also heard of ways where you essentially can look at a resource, have basically a Lambda function looking at a DynamoDB table that you've populated with all of your tagging information, your valid tagging information. So say it's cost center, and then you have all of your valid cost centers. You can actually have a Lambda go out and look at all of your, say, EC2 instances and the tags that are basically looking at that cost center key. And then if the value is either blank or it's not correct, it notifies you to let you know that, you know, it either needs to be tagged, or it can tag it automatically with a tag that you've defined that you want to use from a cost center. So that's a little technical, and I apologize, but there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. And then honestly, like, go in and manually do it. If you have a couple hundred EBS volumes or 100 EC2 instances and you just need to get them tagged, like, sometimes it's easier just to go in and get a Tiger team together and spend an hour with 10 people getting stuff tagged. Sometimes that's the easiest way to do it, but it is then taking a step back and starting to think about proactively, how do we make sure that the tags are not going to get out of hand again.
Okay. Similar to that, there's a lot of questions about what do I do with all the stuff that didn't get tagged. So, you know, I've got my tags done, and I've got this stuff left. What do I do with it? There's other ones about, you know, that shared, like some of those shared reservations, like if you've got reserved instances, what do you do with those? How do you, what are some of the recommendations you have in that area?
Yeah, great question. This is where I highly encourage the use of cost categories or accounts as a fallout for any sort of untagged resource or foundational resource. So if you have a lot of CloudWatch running and CloudTrail and some things that can't be tagged, or you have network monitoring in there, or some application monitoring software, whatever it is, there are some things that can't be tagged, or they're like kind of foundational, not really tied to any specific application that may or may not be in an account. So what you do is you have a cost center or business line assigned to accounts. So when things aren't tagged appropriately, or when things can't be tagged, they just fall out to the cost center that you've defined as part of that account. And that probably doesn't sound great to a lot of you, but what you'll see is when that cost center starts to get hit with expenses, somebody cares. The finance and accounting group and the business cares that that cost center is going to get sent money. And what will they do? They'll start to look at, okay, what can we tag? What aren't we tagging? What do we need to change in order to make sure that things get tagged appropriately? So you're starting to put the onus on the business or the technical teams that are running those resources in that account to actually tag appropriately. So that's the goal, right? Is getting the cost to somewhere and making it as right as possible. There's a good chance it won't be perfect ever, but that's okay as long as it's going overall to the right person. So that's one way to do it, and you can do the same type of thing with cost categories as well. Ensuring that you're ultimately getting the expenses back to at least the right business line or right product, if you will.
I'm trying to look through the list of questions here real quick and figure out what the best way is in our limited
and one more thing to answer some of these real quick is just, you know, if you have a certain amount of untagged, you always can do more or less the easy button and say, you know what, we're going to proportionally split up this this untagged spend based on what is tagged and send it to folks in that manner. That's not a great way to do it, but it's absolutely a possible way to do it as well. So yep. Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. Let's see, there's someone who just made a comment of that you can set policies for resources to be deleted if there's no tags.
Correct, yep.
There is a question about the cost intelligence dashboard. I'm just going to answer it because I actually know the answer.
Awesome.
All right, I know Aaron's going to probably, you know, Diane is he's on the audience here as well. But for the cost intelligence dashboard, I'm sure there's a cost associated with that. How is that determined? And it is determined by the size of your storage. It's all based on AWS resources. There's no charge for that, that setup. It's just the services you use to do it. And the cost, if I'm gonna, I'm sure Aaron's gonna tell me, but I know it's less than $100 a month. I think it's less than $50 a month, depending on the size of your account. Sometimes it can be less than $10. So it all
depending on QuickSight licenses. So, you know, if you wanted 1,000, you know, QuickSight licenses, that would change the price as well. And the different, obviously, the different types of QuickSight licenses. So the actual tool in and of itself is very low cost, and overall, it's a very low cost. So.
Yep. And it's all dependent on how big your data is.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, all right, I am going to, we talked about setting up for new, and we talked about a little bit about setting up existing. So I think we've got those ones covered. There's a lot of questions around the cost and usage Justice Cost and Usage Report in general about what will we see in there? You know, the tags, the cost categories. That's all going to be in there. It's all by line item. Yep. And then there are other questions around how can I, like, what do we recommend for setting up a show back and charge back? Is it easier if you've got a cost center that's one account? It's easier to say an account plus a tag plus a cost category? What kind of, like, if you were starting from scratch and you were designing for cost allocation to begin with, what would you tell someone?
Yeah, so I honestly would say when you're designing your account strategy, ensure that it lines up with your organization as a whole, and then align accounts to specific cost centers. That in and of itself at least allows you the ability to have ownership over that account. So if you have, you know, say 3 accounts or 2 accounts per business line or per department. So say in like your HR or your finance, you have prod and pre-prod, and say you have a dev too, if you wanted it. Make sure that all 3 of those accounts that are under that organization or department, business line, whatever you want to call it, are aligned to a cost center. Because what that allows you to do is then look at other data and say, who's the owner of this cost center? Who's managing this budget? You know, who's responsible for it? And then at minimum, if your tagging strategy doesn't work perfectly, things will be able to fall out to that cost center and you'll still have the ability to charge back to someone. And that's the goal, is as much as possible, get what you have, the spend back to at least the appropriate high level area. And that at least allows you to make sure that a department or a business line that's using X, even if they didn't tag it, still sees what they're using. So as much as possible, align your account strategy with your organization. If you want to do it by application or product, that's totally fine too, but make sure at least you have per account a cost center that's aligned to it, so you know and everyone else knows who owns that and who's going to be responsible for paying for it.
Okay, we have a question specifically about using cost categories. So I want to show back the governance accounts proportionally using cost categories. How do I actually do that? I set up a cost category with governance accounts and hit it proportional, but how do I actually see it split up?
Yeah, so that, Lisa, I don't know if you can answer that one, but that, I believe, is there's actually a web page that demos how that works, and we could send the link after this. But it should be proportionally, you should be able to actually create it within the cost category and in the console.
On slide 31.
Pardon me?
In the appendix, if you slide down, I think there's a cost category based allocation.
Sure, yeah, good call.
So there's extra slides that will be in the deck when it gets sent out later. So you won't see it in the cost category itself necessarily, but you would see it in the tools that are using. So within within the tools that you would use it with.
Yeah, so first and foremost, this is what you would see in Cost Explorer. And then there is, I don't think we have a screenshot. There is within the console, within cost categories, you would actually see, proportionally, I've created this cost category. I want it to go percentage wise to X, Y, and Z. And you can actually see that in the console. But this is the way that you would actually kind of filter that and visualize it within Cost Explorer.